guidelines for thesis writing, MPhil, PhD? It's over to you, sir.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alright, so actually I have a lot of experience with teaching students how to do research. At Islamic University, when I was teaching, there was a long period where nobody was doing a thesis. Lots of people would get enrolled in the MS program and no theses were being produced. So finally I started teaching a course, and I also did a lot of write-up of the important things so that are needed to do a research. So there is a site, a website, which is indicated on this, which has a guide to students for developing research proposals. In addition, there are 2 entire courses which I taught, and these were 1 semester courses in which the goal was to prepare the students to write a thesis proposal. And in fact, that was the condition for passing the course, that at the end of the course you had to have a research proposal ready. A research proposal is not the same as writing a research thesis. अच्छा बात करें ऐसा करें कि notes ना लें, because everything that you are going to write has already been written up in a better way. So try to listen to what I am saying and understand what I am saying. The process of taking notes interferes with the process of understanding. And one reason that we will get into the reasons why student takes notes. Basically, our system of education is based on memorization and replication, and with no involvement of the brain. So in that case, note taking is fine, but our goal in doing research is to understand things. If you understand what I am saying, you will be able to remember it. If you don't understand, then you will not understand it from reading your notes. So these things are available. The student guide is available. It has a lot of information. In fact, I am going to cover some of this information. In fact, I was trying to prepare this lecture and I couldn't really do it good job because there's so much material. It's a 1 semester course and I had to pick and choose. I'm not sure if I made the right selections, and I don't know even if I'll be able to cover what I'm planning to in this short period of time. But anyway, what I want to say is all of the material is available on the website and also in the lectures. So anything that you miss, you can watch and you can read. So first step in doing anything is to make the right niyat for it, because innamal a'mal bin niyat. So the question is, why are we doing research, and what will we get from it? So the first thing is that research will lead to the acquisition of knowledge. It's very important that research is not about finding something to put on the paper which will convince the teacher that you are able to get the degree. No, you are trying to learn some things which are important. Knowledge is very important. If you know that the first wahi that was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in the Ghar of Hira, it starts with the word Iqra, read. Reading is the key to knowledge. And if the only way to produce a thesis is to read a lot of work. If you don't read, you cannot produce a thesis. So it starts with Iqra, Bismi Rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqal insana min alaq. Allah Ta'ala is revealing a very important piece of information, that how Allah Ta'ala created man. Iqra wa rabbukal akramul ladhi allama bil qalam, allama al insana ma lam ya'lam. So all of these things are in this ayat are such that you could write books about it. Allah Ta'ala is saying that He taught by the pen. And you see, you have to think of the context. Here Prophet ﷺ is searching for guidance. He does not know the religion. This is the very beginning. He is searching for God. He does not know who God is. So here God is introducing himself, that meet me, learn about me, who am I? So how does he? Allah Ta'ala has 1,000 and more sifat, that even if all of the water in the oceans is turned into ink and we start writing, it will be finished and there will be no end to the characteristics of Allah. But Allah Ta'ala, the first thing He is telling about Himself to our Prophet is that I am the one who taught man that which he did not know. This is very significant. Allah Ta'ala is the giver of knowledge. And if you have, and the Muslims who got that knowledge, what did they do with it? Think about this. That the Muslims at that time, the ignorant Arabs, they were the most backward people on the planet. At that time there was the advanced civilization of China. They had philosophers, they had invented gunshot, they had invented printing and paper. There was the Indians, they had invented mathematics, they had invented astronomy and calculations, they had a lot of advanced technology. There was the Persian civilization. They had carpet weaving, they had many advanced technologies which even now the people don't have. There was the Egypt. They built these pyramids, and the pyramids are built in such a way that the bricks are slanted, and they are huge bricks, tons and tons, and you put one brick on top of the other and the slant matches. This requires technology that recently the engineers said that it requires, we can now do this with the help of the laser. We can cut the stone so accurately that it will match when we put. But before laser, they don't know how to do this. So how did they do that? They didn't have any lasers in that time. So they had very advanced. They used to make these mummies which would preserve the body for thousands of years. Even now they are here. Nobody knows how to do that anymore. So there was the Roman civilization. They had their own accomplishments. So there were a lot of civilization. Arabs, they didn't have anything. They were Bedouin in the desert. They were riding on camels and they knew only the basics. They didn't have any literature. They didn't have any philosophy. They didn't have anything that is the accomplishment. They lived very simple lives. Suddenly they became leaders of the world. In 30 years the Muslims had conquered half the world, and they built a civilization which lasted for 1,000 years, and it was a unique civilization built on Islam. It didn't match anything that had come before. Now lots of people have conquered the world. वो तातारियों ने किया और स्कंदर ने किया, but it was just temporary, one shot and then it's finished. But the Muslims, they built a civilization which lasted. Why? Because it was built on knowledge. You see, in the material world, we think that we are living in the 20th century, 21st century, which was very materialistic. It taught you and me, everyone, that material is what matters. The substance, what you can see and touch and feel, this is what matters. And what is invisible, what we think, what our feelings, these things don't matter. But if you look at what happened, so according to our modern materialistic mentality, we would say that, well, how did Muslims conquer the world? It must have been that the Prophet ﷺ gave them some new weapon, gave them some new technology, built factories for them. But if we look at the history, there is nothing like that. So what was it? I mean, there must be some cause. How did the Muslims become leaders of the world? He did not teach them new tactics of warfare. There is no mention of this in the books. So how did they conquer the world? Well, those who have studied it said that it was because Islam made Muslims thirsty for knowledge. So they went after knowledge, and you can look at how much effort the Sahaba made to acquire knowledge. There is so much sacrifice and struggle and effort they made, and it was because of this knowledge which they acquired from all over the world that they became leaders of the world. And today we are backwards because the thirst for knowledge has been lost. The students come in and they say, what is it I can do that will make the most money in the shortest amount of time? It doesn't matter what I mean, this is a real thing. Some student came and asked me. I said, well, what are you interested in? And he said, well, I'm interested in making money. So I said, my experience is that if you have interest, like you like mathematics, then your interest helps you to do more, you can get higher, greater competence, and then you can do more things with that. He said, I'm only interested in making money. I will do anything that will make money. So it was very difficult for me. You see, this is the thing which knowledge is not subordinate to the making of money. Money is subordinate. You use money in order to get knowledge these days. That's also a sad thing about this world, that in the Islamic civilization, it was never the case that if you came and said, I want to learn something, I want to study, if you say, okay, bring me your money, then I will teach you. The desire to learn knowledge was understood and supported and respected by the whole society, and anybody who wanted to be a student could be, so other people would provide for his worldly needs so that he could be free to pursue knowledge. But today everything has turned upside down. So it was the respect for knowledge. You see, there is so much about knowledge in the Quran and the Hadith, and how important it is, how the person who seeks knowledge is like the one who is making jihad. Teaching it to those who do not know is like charity, sadaqah. And reviewing and learning knowledge is like tasbihat. And through knowledge you will know and worship Allah. And with knowledge, Allah Ta'ala gives people respect and makes them leaders and imams who will guide the other people. So we seek knowledge for its own sake, not to get a degree, not to get a job, not to earn money, not to show off to other people, not to debate and argue, and not to put down others. These intentions are haram when in the seeking of knowledge, and if someone has these intentions, these will cause lacks of barakah. So first thing is to understand why we are doing research, and doing research is to acquire knowledge about the world. And so the first topic is how will we choose the topic on which we will do research. So the students are in scarcity mode. They think that there is a very small number of topics, and I remember that we would go around the class and we would ask that, okay, why don't you tell me what you're interested in? So somebody would stake out a topic, and other people say, oh, I was going to work in that. There's only a small number of topics, and if somebody takes a topic, then I cannot take it. And so it is not like that. The amount of research, amount of knowledge that is currently existent is like a drop in the ocean. The amount of things that need to be researched and that we can learn is like the whole ocean. So there is never any scarcity. There is a huge number of things that need to be researched that nobody knows anything about. So that is the abundance mode of thinking. There is the scarcity mode, which the economists teach you that everything is scarce, so we have to grab our share and we have to hold on to it, and if I get it then you can't, and if you get it then I can't. This is scarcity thinking. This is very harmful in economics as well as in knowledge, but knowledge especially. Knowledge is a treasure which is increased by the giving of it. This is very strange. So when I was in USA, there were some people, and there still are, that very jealously guard their research, that I should get the benefit of it and nobody else should. And if somebody steals my research, then I will lose. So Imam Bukhari was famous for his memory. So it is said that when he was young, he was traveling and he was carrying notes, and his caravan was robbed. So the robbers were taking everything away. So he went to the chief of the robbers and he said that, I have these books. They are of no value to you, but they are everything that I have learned, and I have recorded them. So please don't take these books. So the chief laughed. He said that, I have stolen a lot of things, but I have never stolen knowledge. So this made Imam Bukhari very embarrassed, and he said that he made dua that, Allah Ta'ala, give me a memory so that I can. And then he got an extraordinary memory. He would read a book and once, and he would know it by heart. The stories that are narrated about him are so incredible that it's hard to believe. But now we know that the photographic memory phenomena exists. And so the thing is that in choosing a topic, the first thing is to relax your heart, that it is not that everything has been done. In fact, nothing has been done. What has been done is seriously wrong. Basically, what we are suffering from as an ummah is an inferiority complex, that it will take us 100 years to catch up to the West, and after that we can do research. This is the very common mode of thinking. This is just wrong, in the sense that I have a paper that you should read on the origins of Western social sciences. So the Muslims think that Western social science is the same as Western physical science, and they think that because that is what the West teaches. The West teaches that social science and physical science, they are the same. The law of gravity and the law of supply and demand, they are the same. And same in the sense that they are equally laws. This is wrong. This is false. The laws that are of social science are not laws, and social science is not a science. And this is just a mistake that has been made by the West. And nearly everything they are saying about social science is wrong. And therefore, there is a huge room for us to do the right thing, because nothing is known. What they are saying is completely wrong. And they start by saying that in economics, that human beings are basically selfish and that they maximize utilities, and this is the basis of everything else that is known. This is completely wrong. Human beings are basically generous, they are not selfish, and they are cooperative, they are not competitive. The cutthroat competition, which is the basis of your theory of the firm, is just wrong. People don't like to cut the throats of others. They like to have friendship and cooperate. And in the Islamic tradition, the stories are told that the traders who went to Indonesia, the Muslims never conquered Indonesia. They just had traders going there, and people became Muslims by the effect of these traders. And why? Because these traders were not competitive. They would say that, okay, I have done enough sales for today, and my brother over there has not made any sales, so why don't you go and buy this thing from him instead of buying it from me? So this kind of non-profit maximization behavior is what impressed the people, and it made them convert to Islam. And today also, I mean, we can be living proofs that the economic theory is wrong just by acting in generous and sympathetic way and in compassionate way, instead of trying to just grab everything for yourself, which is what economic theory tells you, that this is how humans behave. So basically, all of the social science theories in the West are completely wrong. So we don't need to worry that, they have made 100 years of progress and how can we catch up with them. They don't have anything. What they have is ignorance. So the only problem is that, you see, we are standing at zero, they are at negative, but we are looking at them, so we are behind them. If we just turn around, you will be ahead of them. At zero. Of course, at zero you are not doing anything, you have to make progress. I mean, knowledge requires effort and work, but there is no need for inferiority, because the West knows nothing. There are lots of things that, for example, Amartya Sen has written a book called Development as Freedom, in which he has said that, all of this talk about how development will occur when we acquire money, this is wrong, and this is what has been being taught, and this is what is being taught to you, the solo growth model. The more capital you have, the more development occurs. And how do you get capital? Well, there is a process of accumulation. You save more and more money, and it grows by the production function. This is completely wrong. It has nothing to do with development. Development is about how human beings live and how their lives, if they have, and what Amartya Sen says is basically it's about developing human capabilities. If the human beings are capable of doing a lot of things, then we have development. If they don't have capabilities, then they don't have development. And these things can be taught without necessarily having money. Some things cost money, some things don't. So the only thing that what I was trying to say is that the leading theories now, actually, and also in economics, people are slowly coming to recognize the importance of the invisible factors like human capital. Human capital is but basically it means that people did the accounting for growth models. They tried to find out, and since the early 20th century, the idea was that the more capital you have, the more growth you have. They looked at growth of countries, and they looked at the capital, and they found that there was not a very strong correlation. Some countries were growing even though the capital was not, and some countries were not growing even though and so they tried to find out where is this gap coming from, and they found that it was coming from the human capital. They are not measuring properly what is going on in the lives of human beings. So this has been added as but this is not really the correct understanding. Basically everything is human capital. Machine capital is a small addition to the story. So they have got the picture reversed. They are thinking that the main thing is machines, but human beings can also make a little bit of difference, which is whereas the real story is the opposite, that human beings are everything, but machines can make a little bit of difference. Now, what Amartya Sen said, that there's these capabilities, but what are these capabilities? And that he cannot say anything, because this depends on the normative, what is good and what is bad. And this is something which they don't have any idea about. And this is what Islam guides us, that these are the capabilities that you need to develop. And if we develop, and this is what the Prophet ﷺ did. He developed the capabilities of the Sahaba, and they became leaders of the world. And the same path is open for us today. And it is not something that we can learn from any of the books in the West. They don't have any idea of what it means. Say there is a book which is written by Julie Rubin. She is a professor at Harvard, and the book is called The Making of the Modern University, Transformation and the Marginalization of Morality. So basically what she says is that in the early 20th century, if you go and look at the college catalog for any colleges, Harvard, or you will see that it contains that our goal is to teach the students to be good human beings, to have strong character, to be leaders, to understand and fulfill their social responsibilities to society and their civic responsibilities to the nation. These were the objectives, and the schools had courses on civics. Maybe I think some of you may know there are no longer any such courses, but the object of such courses was to make you understand that you have responsibilities as a citizen, what are these and how can you fulfill them. But this idea has been abandoned. So anyway, what Julie Robin writes is that that was true in the 20th century, and we tried to do these things, but we failed. And ultimately, the whole book is about what were the efforts that were made to try to achieve this, and how they did not succeed, and how they were abandoned. So ultimately, at some time in the 60s, if you open a catalog, you will see no mention about building the character and the personality and the social responsibility, and these are no longer part of the game. All they do is they teach you the technical skills, which are basically mechanical. They don't teach you what it means to be a human being. So the example is that they will teach you how to build an atom bomb, but not that it is wrong to kill people. So this has had an effect. There is a book by David Halberstam, who is a newspaper writer, journalist, called The Brightest and the Best. And this book studies how the best students in the USA, the ones who had educations at Yale and Harvard, they were given the charge of running the war in Vietnam, and they conducted it like complete barbarians. They killed and they destroyed, and they would take decisions on killing innocent civilians and babies and children, and spraying their farms so that nothing would grow and people would get cancer and die. And they didn't have any conscience. This is the condition of. And ultimately McNamara, who was one of them, towards the end of their life he said that, I'm sorry for what I did, and I think this was wrong, but it's too late to be sorry. All the people have died. So the thing is that the education of the West does not teach you anything about what it means to be a human being. All of social science is about what it means to be a human being. So they are completely blind. So the problem that we are having here as Muslims currently is that we are so impressed by their accomplishments that it is hard for us to believe that they could be completely. Of course, they have done tremendous things. They have made the computer, and they have built the rocket ships which go to the moon, and they are doing genetic analysis, and they are doing things which are absolutely incredible. They are very complex and very difficult, and they have made tremendous achievements in physical sciences, because the physical sciences is about dead things, about materials. But the social sciences, they are completely bonkers. They have no idea about what human beings are. The dominant school of behavioral psychology, which governed the 20th century, was dominant for the most part, says that human beings are robots. You can program them by stimuli, by rewards and by punishment. And basically, just like you analyze a robot, so you can analyze. They have nothing. There is nothing inside. They respond to stimuli. So actually this was proven wrong. I mean, ultimately, so the hold of behavioral psychology was broken. There are new schools of thought called cognitive psychology and other types of psychology, because human beings are not robots and you cannot predict what they will do just by looking at the stimulus and response. There is something inside. So in the same situation, very adverse, very difficult situation, somebody will break and he will become depressed and suicidal. Other people will become strengthened and they will become stronger and they will go on to do great things because of the difficulties that they face. And it depends on what's inside. So you cannot take unlike what the stool of behavioral psychology taught for a long time, and it still continues to be a very important school of thought and still continues to influence how people think. So what I'm saying is that the superiority of the West in physical science does not mean that they are superior in the physical sciences. And this mistake, that because they are so advanced in physical sciences, they must be advanced also in social sciences, we have to accept. Also because they are perpetuating it. They are saying that social science is a science and it is accurate and it is empirical and it is validated. Halanki, all of these things are wrong. So first thing to do is to not believe that, because that puts you if you say that, okay, they have 300 years of knowledge, then obviously it will be difficult to. And it is difficult, for example, if you want to compete with the West in physics, it's very hard. We cannot. As a nation, of course, individuals can and do. So we have Abdul Salam and we have other people who have. But as a nation, if we want to do as a group, they have much more advanced. It will be very difficult for us to compete. But this doesn't mean that we can not compete in economics. So, for example, Lucas, he's a Nobel Prize winner. He knows a lot about economics, but his wife left him, so to go with somebody else. So just because he is expert in economics doesn't mean that he knows about his duties to the family. And Lucas said in 2006 in a presidential address to the Economic Society that we economists have solved the most fundamental problem of economics, which is to prevent recessions. Now no more recessions will happen. In 2007 there was the global financial crisis. So they don't know anything about economics. And so we don't need to be inferior. Anything that... See, this is the most fundamental thing. I'm spending a lot of time on the preliminaries, and because the first thing to do is to, before you start, you have to have the vision. Where are we going with this? If you say, okay, the West has created, now basically everything is known, I'm going to make a little bit of a twist. I will take an article from AER and change the data a little bit and copy their model, then of course there's nothing worth doing. But if you say that I am going to explain things which Keynes could not, then that's a separate matter. And that's true, that at this point Keynes was wrong and Friedman was wrong and Lucas was wrong, and all of these economists, they have made tremendous mistakes in terms of understanding what economics is. If you look at I have put up 3 lectures on macroeconomics, in which I have explained how everything that you have been taught about macroeconomics is wrong. So, and it's wrong because of the illusion that economics is a science. Because this illusion exists in your books, you are taught economics as a universal theory. The macroeconomics, the ISLM curve, all of these things are true everywhere. They are true in Africa, and they are true in Pakistan, and they are true in England, and they are true in the 19th century and in the 21st century. Obviously this is wrong. Everybody with half a brain can understand that this cannot be true. It cannot be true that the ISLM curve applies to Africa and to Canada and to Pakistan in the same way. So then what is right? Well, basically it's very simple to fix the problem. The problem is that because they were so impressed with science, the Western people, they said that we have to make social science into a science, otherwise it won't be knowledge. So they threw out history. Now you cannot understand economics without history. And so you have to take the science out. If you want to understand what Keynes was saying, you have to go and study what was happening in the Great Depression. Why did it happen? You have to see who was doing what. You have to study the history. But if you study the history, then we are saying that Keynesian economics is applicable in 1930s to try to understand what was happening. Actually, Keynes even made mistakes. So if you want to understand Keynesian economics, then you have to understand what was happening in 1929, what were the existing theories at that time, and what were their defects, and how did Keynes improve. So all of this is historical context, but it means that Keynesian economics is not science. It is something particular which applies in 1929. Then we can see if there are any common elements between what was happening there and what is happening today in Pakistan, and if there are, there may be something can be learned from it, maybe not. Maybe nothing is relevant for us. But all of these things require studying history, which, according to the West, you don't need to do, because the hallmark of science is the law of gravity should hold. It should not be that there is a Pakistani law of gravity and there is a British law of gravity, and these two are different, and we have to study the history of Pakistan. So science is like that. But about the law of supply and demand, it's not like that. There was demand for textiles in Pakistan, in India, because the British destroyed our textile industries, and they forced the production of raw materials, and then they took those to England and made the cotton and fabrics, and they exported it back to Pakistan and India. So Gandhi protested them. He said that we should just use domestic produced cloth, which was very rough and hard. It was not that we lacked the skills. In fact, when the British came, the textile industry was far ahead of anything that they had in England. But these factories were shut down and destroyed, and the cotton weavers, who were very skillful, their thumbs were cut off in order to prevent them from being able to use. So finally our industry collapsed, and now we are talking about why we are lacking industry. We were deindustrialized, and now the question is being asked, why don't we have industry? And it's like this. If today, if you were at the AGM, the question of was debated, why are some nations wealthy and why are some nations poor, and how can the nations which are poor become wealthy, and so on. There have been several books written about this topic. So the most important one which is not getting any attention, is a book by Stavrianos, which is called Global Rift. And basically he explains that, look, people were at the same level of development, then for various reasons the Europeans were fighting with each other for 300 years continuously, and they developed very strong fighting skills. While the rest of the world was living peacefully, they didn't learn how to fight, and European acquired gunpowder and machine guns, which were their great invention, and so they acquired a monopoly in violence and savagery. So they went and conquered the world, really. They had these guns and they conquered the world, and they robbed it. They took all the resources and they took it. And now we ask the question, why is England rich and why are we poor? Maybe it's because the individuals are very lazy, they have the wrong culture, they don't have the right institutions. People are talking, there's a book that the main reason that its property rights is crucial, that in the developed countries, in India and Pakistan, we don't have well-defined property rights, and that's the crucial ingredient which leads to success. Now the thing is that our system of patwaris, etc., was very, very accurate, and we had very well-defined property rights. When the British came, they seized the properties of all the awqaf and basically people who would produce their records, and they would just find some way to say that this is not legitimate, and so property rights were destroyed in the colonialism. So basically, it's very simple. Somebody robs you, and then he becomes rich, and you become poor. There's no need to write volumes and volumes of books and do very deep analysis as to why he is poor and why I am rich. So, all of this to explain that there are the stories which are being told about, Daron and Ajmi-Aulu and Robinson. These are just plain false, and it's very easy to prove, and you have the job to present the other story, and you can do it by your research. So this is the big thing. There's an elephant in terms of the work that needs to be done, and you will not be able to do all of it. You just pick a small piece of the puzzle and you put it together, and basically the huge thing is constructed by a lot of people working together and making small contributions to a big project. That is how it happens. It doesn't happen that one person comes in and puts the whole thing together. So there are nearly everything that has been said in economic theory is wrong, and now you can take just one piece and say this is wrong and the right thing is this. So there is a lot of work to be done. This work is not automatic. As I said, that we don't need to learn all of the things that the West is teaching in terms of their books. They are not relevant to understanding. But there are things we need to learn. We need to learn history. We need to learn basic data analysis. What the data, if something is going up, something is going down. These are things that are easy to understand, and data is useful in some places, not in all places. And so we will have to work to produce good research, but it is not that all of the things have been done. Like this is the misleading idea that makes it difficult to do research. Nothing has been done. It's an open field. Anything you do, any topic you take, what you can be confident about is what 90% of what is being said is wrong. In 10% they have some good idea, like Amartya Sen has a good idea about development, that it is about capabilities, but they don't have the last word. We already have, our Islam teaches us more than what their best people are currently thinking of. Now currently the idea is that trust is very important in the process of development. But why, how, all of these things, and how to develop trust, all of these things Islam can teach us. Experimental game theory cannot. Experimental game theory is at the cutting edge. Now these are the things that are going to matter. But we are already, our tradition contains a lot more wisdom than anything that they have currently. So we are starting at an advantage, but it is a potential. It is not realized. That is, we don't have that wisdom. We don't have our own Islam with us. So we have to study that very hard. We have 1,000-year-old intellectual tradition, and there is lots of wisdom and insight and depth. We never studied. We spent basically the Rostow model for growth. We have studied 7 stages. What did Rostow do? Basically, Rostow looked at the history of England, and he broke up into stages. And he said, okay, in the first stage, this was what happened in England, and in the second stage. He said, okay, everybody will have to follow that. That's how progress occurs. It's very stupid. So we have studied that. Now, the thing is that the Prophet ﷺ also provides a model for development. He came to the desert, and the people were the most backward people on the planet. They had very low GNP per capita, and they didn't have anything. And in 30 years, the Muslim had conquered half the world, and they had become leaders of a civilization which lasted for 1,000 years. So shouldn't we be studying this 30-year model for growth? How come we are not? There must be something there. How did it happen? So this is important. We need to learn that. And today the inferiority complex is such that we spend hours and hours and times to study the Rostov model, but nobody studies the Prophet's model for development. So now the thing is that it won't, as I said, we are at zero, but we are still ahead of the West. But you cannot make research from zero. You have to work. You have to work, and you have to learn the history. You have to read the literature. What are they saying? Even though they are saying wrong things at this time, because they are in control, so we have to learn what wrong things they are saying and how to prove them wrong. And this requires effort and struggle. So we don't have those skills. We have to acquire those skills. So we have to have confidence in ourselves, and we have to have tawakkul, that if I struggle to do something good, Allah Ta'ala will provide me with the means to do this. So this is before we start. Okay. So now the second thing is that in order to learn, the first step to doing research is to prepare an annotated bibliography. This means basically reading a lot of things and summarizing what they say. So now, if you know, there's I think somebody by the name of McCloskey, shayad, and she has written a book about the rhetoric of economics. So what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is basically how you persuade other people. So he writes that Paul Samuelson wrote this book which was very influential, called The Foundations of Economics. And in this he used a lot of heavy maths. At that time mathematics was not used by economists. So basically what McCloskey says is that none of this mathematics is necessary. The economics points that you're trying to make, basically demand and supply. If something is in short supply, then it will be expensive. This is something which you and I can understand without drawing any graphs and without doing any calculus and without doing any very complicated thing. If you know and anybody in the street can understand this. It's not something which, you know, if somebody asks me what is L'Hopital's rule, or how do you differentiate a function, I'd say if you haven't studied calculus, I cannot explain it to you. You will have to sit down and take hours and hours of courses, and then you will be able to understand. But if somebody asks why did the price of tomatoes rise today, so I could say that, well, you have to take the course in economics, and then you will study about the utility maximization and the firm's profit maximization, and one will make the demand curve and the other will make and then you will have to study the Walrasian equilibrium and then you will understand. Or I could say, well, today there was a shortage in the supply of tomatoes, and people will understand. You don't need to really explain a lot. So the rhetoric of economics is Karl Marx said that, the point that I was trying to make was very simple, but if I had made it in a few pages, people would not have understood how important it is. So I had to write 3 volumes of Das Kapital, and I had to explain it in a very complicated way so that people would become very impressed with what I was doing. So exactly like that. The basic ideas, the important ideas of economics are very simple, very easy to understand, and don't require a lot of math. All of this math is put to fool people into believing that these are very complicated ideas, and You don't, especially those Kala people, they don't have the brains to understand them. So let us Gora people come and solve your problems for you. And this is working very well. Today, if I asked you what are the problems in Pakistan, you say, well, let's go and find out. The people who are in policy, they say, okay, let's look at the Washington Consensus. We don't have privatization, we don't have free trade, our customs barrier, our governance problems, and this and that and the other. Where is this coming? All of this is coming from Washington, D.C. What about opening our eyes and using our brains and looking? What are the problems here? The Gora person doesn't understand. What are the problems? We know the problems. We are living in this society. But we lack the self-confidence to be able to say. So the top 20 problems which are being addressed by Pakistani problems are not our top 20 problems at all. Because we have never tried to solve our own problems for our own selves. So, one of the things that is necessary is that we shouldn't be impressed by the apparent sophistication of what is being said. You can always take an article and ask, what is this saying? For example, when I was a student, there was an article about tax. And basically, game theory was very popular, so what they constructed was, they said, we are going to study the distribution of income in a society. So what we will study is we will create a game. In this game, a coalition forms, and the majority coalition gets to decide what is going to be the tax rule. So people get together and they form a coalition, and the one who can form the majority coalition, they gets to decide taxation. So what will happen in this game? Well, it's very easy. The majority coalition will be formed with 51% of the people, and the tax rule they will decide is that take away everything from the rest of the society and we will take it for ourselves. So now the problem is, there are two problems. First of all, the problem is that this is wrong description of how people behave. Economists assume that people are always maximized. This is not true. This is not how actually real people behave. So you can attack this model on this ground. The other solution is that it doesn't correspond to what we see. So the people who were writing this, and they are very famous, there's Aumann and Kurtz, famous game theorists. They said, well, this doesn't quite look like what we really observe. So what we will do is, we will modify this game a little, and we will say that the people who are being taxed, who are not in the majority coalition, they also have a choice. They have a choice that either they can agree to the proposed tax rule, or they can simply destroy their property. So they can burn what they have. So in that case, the taxation rule will not be too tough, because otherwise the other people have a threat, that is to burn. And then they did a lot of fancy mathematics to calculate what will be the equilibrium outcome of this game. And you will never understand, unless you do a lot of heavy duty game theory, what they did. But ultimately they came up with a solution concept which has a taxation rate, that if you have so much income, this is. So now then they said, let's look at this taxation rule and let's look at the reality in the USA. And then they did a lot of some matching, and they said, this seems like a fairly good fit, so we have a good model. Now this is complete nonsense. But the point is that this is the paper, and now you can understand what they are doing. They are creating this artificial model, and then they are looking at the outcome of this model, and then they are matching it to reality. Does this have anything to do with reality? No. How will, because they have See, because they are looking for a mathematical theorem, they are not looking for history. Now, if I want to study taxation, then what I should do is, I should find out in Pakistan I should go to the Federal Revenue Board and find out how they implement the tax laws. I should look at history, and I should look at the tax legislation. Who is the one who is passing? Why are the landlords not being taxed here? Well, because MNAs are sitting who are mostly landlords. So most of the things about Pakistan tax we can understand in the context of history. We cannot understand it by studying the Middle East theory of optimal taxation, which is just a mathematical theory which is designed for all possible places without any reference to understanding what is going on in Pakistan. Now what I am telling you is, this is how theory is being done today by the best economists, and they are doing it completely wrong because they don't pay any attention to history. Therefore, if you look at what they are doing and forget about the math, ask what is it saying about the real world. So in the end, the Aman-Kurtz theorem provides a theorem that, okay, your tax will be so and so. There's a rule which you can derive by mathematics, and they say, and so what's is this rule true or is it false? Well, we can prove that it's false. It's coming from the wrong model. Now you have heard about the Friedman's as if methodology. क्या कहते हैं उसको? बहुत मशहूर आर्टिकल है उसका. हाँ? नहीं उसके मेथोडोलॉजी के बारे में आर्टिकल है 1950-60 में लिखा था about as if the Friedman's as if methodology. That model doesn't have to be true. Only the conclusions have to be right. So anyway, the point is that this was invented as a defense to the argument that I am making, that this model is complete nonsense. It makes assumptions which are not true. So Friedman and this is actually the accepted answer for this. The models don't have to be true. People don't have to maximize utilities. It's just that the outcomes should match. That's all that's needed. So that's a wrong argument, but it is needed to defend what economists are doing today. They say, okay, let's assume this, let's assume that. That's why there's the famous joke about the canned food. You know about it, right? Yes. So economists always assume the most difficult problem away, and then they can do whatever they want. But it's just not true. This is not how it works. So wherever they make a false assumption, you have the opportunity to do research to make the right assumption and do it right and show it makes a difference. They make the wrong assumptions about how human beings behave, and of course the most important example is the ultimatum game. Why it's important example is because it is now accepted by economists. They agree that for a long time they fought this result. They said that no, this cannot be true. If you will read my article, which is called Empirical Evidence Against Neoclassical Utility Maximization Theory, a survey of the literature. So it starts with this example and explains why this simple example destroys conventional utility theory. So I am trying to explain that you should not be impressed by bogus mathematics. You should try to every economist, when you write an article, you're saying something about society, about human beings, about people. You're saying that we should tax people at 25%, or we should, ultimately it's saying something about reality. So come to that. What is that? What is he saying? And almost always, 99.9% of the time, what he is saying will be wrong, and you will be able to prove it without having to understand the mathematics. You don't have to argue with the mathematics. You can look at the conclusion and show that it is wrong. If you look at the Middle East optimal taxation, it's a very complicated theory. just look at the rule and they say, okay, what will happen if I apply this rule in Pakistan? And then you can understand what will happen, because what we are trying to study is not mathematical. If I want to study human behavior, if I want to study how you behave, I cannot write a differential equation which will explain it to me. If somebody does, then he will be wrong. And you can prove that he will be wrong, because no differential equation can explain how human beings behave. And no theory of taxation can take into account that the MNAs here are landlords. And so if there is a theory about taxation here which doesn't take that into account, it's wrong. Simple. So everything that is being said by these mathematical models is wrong. And actually, if we were doing things right, we wouldn't need to read those things. We could just throw it in the garbage can and start from zero. But unfortunately today we cannot, because of the dominance of the West. We have to take into account what is being said, and then we are not in the position to dictate what is going to be said. So there's a whole lot of theory. Anyway, so the point I'm trying to make is that you can read a lot. Don't be if you understand what I'm saying, then you can read many things. What the problem that I'm trying to solve, that I saw, you see, I told you I have experience with creating researchers, and basically the first problem was to get them to read. They wouldn't read articles because they would start with an article and then in just one paragraph later there would be a mathematical formula. They say, oh, I can't understand it, so close the article and shut it, and I'm not really capable of doing research, so let the Gora man come and tell me how to live with my wife and how to treat my children and how to solve the problems of Pakistan, because I'm too stupid. So don't do that. Look through the scary tactics. The smoke screen has been created to make you feel that you are dumb. Don't buy it. So read that, read what has been written, summarize it, prepare notes. It's an annotated bibliography. And finally understand that research is not about discovering things. This is the wrong idea that you have been taught, that I have to find something new. So everything that is old, you just get rid of, because that's already known, that's already known, that's already known. So I have to find something new. Where is a new idea? Oh, let me say, nobody has ever studied the effect of income distribution on the fruit growth on Malakand. So let me just run a regression of the income distribution in Rawalpindi on the fruit growth in Malakand. This is a new idea. So this is not how it works. Unfortunately, many people have this idea that nobody studied how the effect of the butterflies in Japan on the earthquake in Argentina, so let me study that. Finding something new is not the way to do research. Find out, research is a conversation. People are talking. You have to learn how to participate in that conversation. Now, which means that you have to read what other people are saying, and you don't worry about finding something new. Most people are always saying, this has been said, so now I can't do it. This has been said, so I can't do it. No, nearly everything which is being said is wrong. So now we have to. This makes the conversation very strange. So people are sitting at the table and they are studying theories and discussing theories, and it's all wrong. Now, how can you participate in this conversation? One way, and unfortunately many of my students have done this, not many but some, even though everything you are saying is wrong. So if you start that, then nobody will listen to you. You will get kicked out of the room. So I have to warn you not to do that. Even though it is true, but you have to, if you are sitting in a conversation and everybody is saying something wrong, then obviously, if you know anything about conversations, you can't say, well, everything everybody is saying is wrong, and I'm going to tell you what the right thing is. No, it doesn't work like that. So what you do is, you look for openings where people are saying wrong things. Some things are more right and some things are less right, and you look for a connection. Where can I introduce something which will be connected to what is being said and which is also right? So it's not easy. I have discovered, for example, the capabilities approach is a place where we can introduce something. That Amartya Sen. So we have to understand what was it that Amartya Sen said. We have to understand that stream of the conversation. People were saying up to Amartya, so you have to read Development as Freedom, and he summarizes the conversation that up to now people have been saying that development is the process of growth and accumulation of capital, and why this is not correct, and why should we talk about human capabilities. All of these, they are there. So you say, okay, very good, Amartya, Mr. Sen has said something very nice. It's about capabilities. Now the question is, what are these capabilities and how can we develop them? And I'm going to do a research on that. And so now you are linked to the conversation that is going on, and you are carrying on, and you are saying, yes, he is right, and you are carrying on in some tradition. Similarly, there's the experimental and behavioral school, in which says that instead of making up theories about how human behaves, let's just look at how people behave. So that's a very good point of entry. You say, okay, let's look. Economic theory teaches us that people are selfish. So what we do is we play the dictator game. I put down 100 rupees in front of this person, and I say that you can keep all of it, or you can give some of it to the other person over there. It's your choice. So now in practice, many people give half to the other person, and most people give something. There are only a very few economists who keep everything. They say that I'm going to maximize my utility. Very few. Now why is that? Well, people are concerned about their reputation. So they don't want to be called Kanjus Makhi Juice. So this is one reason. Possibly they are concerned about fairness and equity. So now we can do a research on that. Because here is an example. It shows, something strange. Economic theory is wrong. Now why is it wrong? Let's do some research on that. So anyway, there is lots and lots of rooms. People are saying that growth of capital is what leads to growth, but maybe it has to do with trust. Maybe it has to do with honesty. How can we make people more honest? We can study about the level of corruption in societies and how it has changed. What are the positive measures that have been taken? Can we implement these? What will the impact of this be on growth? These are questions people are not usually discussing because they don't think these things matter. I mean, the economist said that the only thing which matters is how much money you have. It doesn't matter if you go and steal from the others or rob the others or invade a country and rob all their wealth, because that's their history. That's how they became wealthy, so they think this is legitimate. There's no harm in it. So the lesson of history from the Western economics, if we do our own Rostow's theory, we can say, okay, the way to become wealthy is to invade Iran and Afghanistan and India and conquer these and take all their wealth and become wealthy. That's the Rostow model of growth. That's how England did it. That's how we can do it. Of course, there might be some practical problems in implementing this plan, but anyway, there is a theory of growth. So anyway, this point that research is like a conversation means that we can't just start from zero, that okay, everything the economists have said is all wrong, and so now I'm going to start from zero and I'm going to say that okay, this is the way to do things. You can't do that, because you have to connect to what is being said. And there are many places where you can connect, many places where there is the room to say truth. Some places you cannot. So you have to choose, you have to be careful. Just like in a conversation, if most people are saying something wrong, you cannot come in and say everybody is wrong. You have to be political, you have to think about what is acceptable to this audience. I mean, when you are like what I am saying here is not acceptable in other audiences. Like if I had said this at the AGM, I would be in trouble because a lot of audience are economists. They believe in their economics. I say everything you believe in is wrong. Then that would cause problem. It would not be politically correct. So I have to say it in more carefully. Okay, so you have to read the literature, even though it's wrong. You can't neglect it, because that's and you have to read a lot of literature to see what people are saying. And instead of being impressed by mathematics, you have to study what is the author doing. And I have actually, in my research methodology courses, I get students to go and read article and read it systematically to understand, to extract some key information. The first issue is, when you read an article, is to try to find out what is the real world problem that is under discussion here. So most people will, in most articles, will write that, okay, should we have foreign direct investment? And now if you want to study this question, then what you need to do is to study the history. Where did, so for example, in China there was a lot of foreign direct investment, but and in some other countries there was not. Some countries have progressed without FDI, some countries have, and some countries have been very much damaged by FDI. Now, one of the problem is that, okay, so you can, this is one of the things that find out what is going on, what is the issue that is under discussion. Then, for example, if you look at, there is a book called The New Poor Economics by Duflo and Banerjee. Very important book, because it gives you a lead into many new directions for research. So the real world problem under discussion in this book is that existing approaches to poverty are wrong. This is the basic thesis. What Duflo and Banerjee start out with by saying in the first chapter, they say that people think that poverty is one big problem and it can be solved by one solution. So they say that, okay, she discusses the debate between two people. One of them is, I've forgotten the names. One of the people says that we need massive foreign aid in order to people, the big push is needed. People are trapped in a low-level poverty trap, and if we give a lot of foreign aid, they can break out of it. And once they break out of it, then they will take off into the trajectory for growth. The other person says, that's Easterly, I think. Easterly is on the other side. The other person is Sachs. Yes, Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs says that if you provide a lot of foreign aid, this will lead you to break out of the poverty trap. And Easterly says that no, foreign aid has been tried and it has failed and it will never work, and what you need to do is to let people develop on their own and just have free markets and capitalism and everything will be fine. So what Duflo and Banerjee say is that poverty is not one big problem and there is no one big solution. Actually, there are 1,000 different small problems, and you have to solve each of them in order to get. So no one tablet that, okay, foreign aid and finished, or capitalism and finished. No, there are 1,000 different problems. Each of them has to be solved separately, and then you can. That is what development is about. So that is the real world problem that is under discussion. Research question. So in this book, the research question is, there are many. It's a book, it's not an article. In an article there is usually one research question. So it starts by saying, okay, what's the cause for malnutrition? So that's very interesting. First of all, she goes and explains that malnutrition is a big problem, it causes this, that, and the other, how much malnutrition there is. So these are the things that you need to do. That, okay, so 37% of the children are malnourished, the effect is that their height is stunted. But if that was the only problem, it wouldn't matter. She also documents that they have lower incomes, they have lower intelligence, because malnutrition damages your brain capacities, and they get more disease, and so on. So all of this is then statistical evidence for the importance of the thing that you're trying to do. This is very important. Every person, you will have to make a case. Why am I studying this problem? So, because if I solve this problem, it can bring a lot of benefits. So what are these benefits? You have to go and find out. If it's something very small, maybe it's not worthwhile. So, the research question was that, what is this malnutrition? So, the methodology, so now she goes into existing theories. This is connecting with the literature. So, one very simple theory which everyone has, malnutrition exists because not enough food. Not enough income to buy food. Well, so what she did, this is unique, is to collect data. What happens to the poor people when their income increases? Now, these are poor people, they are malnourished, and they get, there are many ways to study this. I mean, you can give them programs where you, for example, we have the Benazir Income Support Program, we can study this. It has not been studied, this same issue, it has been studied elsewhere. What do the poor do? According to our ideas and theory, the first thing they should do is buy more food so that they can avoid the malnutrition. Is this what they do? What do you think? If you take the poor people in Pakistan who have malnourished children and you give them additional money by Benazir Income Support Program, for example, will the malnutrition be finished? No, okay, it doesn't happen. What will they use this money on, the extra money? They will use it to buy radios, TVs, to have better weddings and so on and so forth. Very little will be spent with food. What about the food also? There was a very interesting experiment in China. The people were given money which they could spend on food. So what did they do? They started buying shrimps and other more delicious food. So they, instead of buying more nutritious food, they buy more delicious food. And if you think about it, it's natural. It's not the poor people are very strange and they are not anybody, all of us. The person who is told that, look, sugar is harmful for you, don't eat it and you should diet. When they are given the chocolate cake, they will eat it. They will not say that, okay, this is bad for my health and I should not do it. In the same way, the poor do not eat. So, we look at the data. This is the methodology. We run an experiment. We give people more income and we see whether they buy more food. So if that's not so, then that means that providing more income will not do the problem, not solve the problem. So what are the policy implications of this? Policy implications are that, what do you think? One of the things, and another thing that is part of the study is that look at the income of the person. Is it possible for this person to buy enough food to provide adequate nutrition for the family? What do you think the answer to this question is? Can most people in Pakistan buy food that would be sufficient to eliminate malnutrition. Malnutrition is a huge problem here. 37% of children or more are malnourished. Is it due to not enough income to buy the calories that they need? No, it's not. Calories are there. Yani, the thing is that the type of food that you need, that you need to eat, is something that doesn't appeal. For example, tofu is a very cheap, high protein rich food. A woman who are very poor are giving their children slanties and this sugar water juices, when for the same money you could buy an egg which is highly nutritious, has a lot of protein in it. So money is there, but so there are two things involved. One is that we need to produce food. So the policy implication is that if somebody knows a biscuit manufacturer, if you can produce a delicious biscuit with high proteins, that would be good, because the delicious part is important. You can produce high calorie stuff which is very cheap, but people won't eat it if it's not delicious. And not only delicious, it also has a lot to do with status. If you would say that, okay, this is something that the poor eat. So if you produce a delicious biscuit and advertise it on the TV as something which is the elite class likes, even though it may be a complete falsehood, maybe the elite class doesn't eat it, but if you advertise it and it acquires a status, then people will buy it and eat it and will be very happy. It is not just the solution. What I am telling you is that the directions in which the solutions lie are very different from the ones on which people are working. And if you do research and study, you can find pathways which are completely different from what people are doing. And this is open. And it's not that there are just a few little things there. It's wide open, the field, because the work which has been done is completely wrong and misdirected and mistargeted. And as Duflo Banerjee said, there are thousands of problems, and you can take one of them and solve them and make a difference in the world. So there are policy implications. So when you go through the literature, you have to go and identify the gaps. Where is the missing information? Where is the place where there is room for intervention? As I said, there are gaps all over the place, but it takes some experience to identify. For this you need to consult with your supervisor about the gaps, because that's where research is. Research is done by doing the annotated bibliography, looking at the literature, looking at what has been done before, and then finding out either there is a controversy. People are saying there are two positions, growth-led exports and export-led growth. Some people say that if the exports increase, then that will lead to an increase in growth. Other people say that if the growth increases, then automatically people will start exporting more because there's more. So, which is true. Now the thing is that you will learn the answer to this by studying history, not by doing econometrics. And this is where you will have a comparative advantage, because people are not studying history. Now, after you study history and you will come to it is not that difficult, and history provides very solid evidence. Then you will have to translate this to data. You will have to now prove your position so that you link to the conversation, because the conversation is all about models and theory and regression. So first you come to an understanding of the history, explain the history, and then build your model, because it's not really necessary, but the thing is that in order to tie it into existing body of research, you will need to build your model. So when I have written a note on for students on how to do MPhil research. So basically, one of the goals of your research, whether you are doing an MPhil, it applies even more if you are doing a doctorate, is that you should pick an area and then you should be the leading expert in the world on that topic. It's not that difficult in the sense that you should know everything that has been said about this particular topic. What this means is that the topic itself has to be sufficiently narrow that you can do this. Minimum you will need to read about 25 articles and maximum 150. This is the range. Now for this, you need guidance, and your supervisor will know about any topic, that what is the amount of literature. So if you take a topic and there are 1,000 articles on it, then it's too broad, and you have to cut down, specialize. Okay, in this topic I have to. So cut it down until you get to a topic in which there are 10 articles or 20 articles or maximum 50, no more than that. If the topic has more than that, that means the topic is too broad, you have to specialize. So once you choose a small topic, then you should become the world's leading authority on this topic, in the sense that you should know everything that anybody has ever said about this. That is one of the goals of your MPhil research. So once you have an MPhil on a topic, then you should know everything about that topic at that time. Of course, research keeps going on, so you might. Okay. So, this is sort of an outline of the things that you need to construct your thesis. First, you have to have your basic background. This is what is given to you in your courses. The courses are designed to develop in you the ability to read articles. That's what is very important. That is what allows you. That's why we have coursework first, then you start research. The coursework is really basically teaching you the language in which the researchers are talking. Now, the thing is that students feel the inferiority complex. They said that, okay, I really read this Romer, but I didn't really understand it, so it means that I don't have the background. It means that I cannot read. So that's what I was trying to say, that don't worry that you have read those courses and you didn't do very well, or even though you did well, you didn't really understand the textbook. It's not unusual. It's not. In fact, I expect that 99% of the people didn't understand what they studied. The textbook contained a lot of material that just was over their heads. This is deliberate. It's an attempt to, actually the whole object of this jargon and the specialization is to create specialists and to give them this feeling that I can do something which nobody else can do and nobody else had better interfere. So as long as you are you have already acquired enough background in the sense that you have been exposed to the reading, you know the basic terminology, and that's all. It's a language that's being used. You have acquired that language. Right now, you are among the top 1% of Pakistan. You're sitting in a MPhil or PhD program, and how many people in Pakistan get to do that? Now, if you're going to say that I can't do that, then God help us. So, you are the ones who are going to be on the front line of the intellectual battle that is going on. You need confidence, and you should have that. You already have the background that you need. Use that to read the articles. Don't worry about what you don't understand. Try to understand how it applies to the real world. Then, in order to do your thesis in the area, some technique will be being used, or many techniques. So somewhere people are using stochastic frontiers or data envelopment analysis or many other techniques. So in that particular area where you are, computable general equilibrium. So don't be intimidated that, oh, this is beyond my capabilities. No, everything is, you feed it into the computer and you get out numbers, and basically the issue is understanding how to tell stories about those numbers. That's the main skill. How to tell stories. You know how to tell stories, right? So, you have the skill that you need. So, the other part is done, but the hard part is done by the computer. You feed your data into eViews and it will produce the numbers. Now the question is how to tell a story about these numbers. That's where you are required to work. So, some specialized skills are required. You will know what those are by your bibliography, and then you will have to learn. You'll have to learn what is the program and how do I interpret these numbers. Basically, how to interpret numbers is very different from how to produce these numbers. Your courses are teaching you how to produce those numbers. In econometrics, we teach poor students, I pity them, Gauss-Markov theorem, and how to prove this, that, and the other, the constant elasticity of substitution. Oh God. So the point is that, look, there is a way to, very few people can understand how to manufacture a car. Very difficult. And how the system, how the carburetor works, the spark plugs, the combustion, I don't understand. But driving car is easy. Everybody can do it. So basically you are the user of eViews. You are the user of computer. It's easy to understand to how to use these models. It's difficult to understand how to do the theory, how to do the proof, how to do the calculations. Well, let the computer do it. But you can do the interpretation. So the specialized skills that you need, you can acquire as long as you are not afraid. Oh, this is beyond me. Then you will not be able to acquire. So, but there is you will be able to eventually talk a good talk without and scare people by using big words, seemingly unrelated regressions and so on. People will be impressed and say, "Oh, this person knows something. I better not talk. She might expose." So. We will, at the end of the day, the evaluation of your thesis will be based on, basically what I think is that how much human capital you have acquired, how much skill. When I am evaluating a thesis, you have studied the literature, you've mastered it. So all of my students do that. People are looking for shortcuts. This is what they say that, okay, what is the quickest way I can get out of this? So the standard model is that you take an existing paper and then you just change the variables and names, and all of the theory is already there and the equations. So basically it's photocopying a paper, but instead of doing the study for Ghana, you just substitute it for Pakistan. So this is using minimal mental skills, and so such an exercise doesn't lead to anything. It doesn't lead to any knowledge development. One of my students initially came in with a proposal which he had worked on very hard, which was basically to use neural network techniques to estimate, to forecast some time series. So basically, and compare it with the existing ARMA model forecast. After looking at it, I said, okay, this involves that you will take this data for time series and feed it into the neural network package and get some numbers. And you will take this and feed it into the ARMA package and get some other numbers. And then you say, compare them. Oh, this one is better, this one is bad. So this should take 1 hour. How are we going to do this? How is this going to be an MPhil thesis? So then there was a big to-do about this, because the neural networks, they said, this is something this has never been done. So anyway, eventually it worked out. We said how to do these things. So expertise, that you have to study what people have said. And so for example, I told her that, look, if you want to do neural networks, There's a huge amount of literature. Read it, study it, and how neural networks have been applied. Survey it, and find out what are the weaknesses, what are the strengths, where are the areas where neural networks work, where they do not work, and then you can find something, you can do something. Anyway, she shifted to the ARMA model side and did something real. So then we look for the contribution. Now in the MPhil level, the contribution required is very minor. Usually you don't really have to focus very explicitly on contribution. I mean, the students are always looking where I'm going to get my new thing. But don't worry about it. Just worry about the old things. Try to understand what other people have said. Try to replicate their results. Is what they're saying true? In the process, you will automatically discover enough new things that it will make your thesis. One thing I look for, which most people don't, is that how will this make a difference to solving real world problems? And again, I take a pragmatic approach. Sometimes one can get a thesis which is acceptable without making any contribution to the real world. So then go ahead. You don't have to, not every thesis has to be path-breaking. In fact, most theses the students are just is an exercise in showing that they can do research. In your exercise, and later on get your degree, then you can do real world significant things. Some of my students become too ambitious, and in fact it happens too often. So they do theses at MPhil level which are matching to PhD theses, and I try to discourage them, but they are too much motivated and they try to do too much. So then actually in the proposal you have to have a presentation, and presentation skills are very important. And again in this I have mentioned a set of presentations. I took about 20 of them that were presented in my research methods class as the final proposal, and I have done a slide by slide critique that this is not what you should do, this is what is good on this slide, this is what is bad. So if you look at these, you will learn about how to make a presentation for a research proposal. So tomorrow and day after I'll be talking about, in my econometrics class, about the encompassing technique. This is a very important technique, and it has the main point that is made here is that students go and they say, okay, here are these 5 different models for FDI in Pakistan, and I'm going to make a 6th one. So people have run regression with demographic variables, and they have run it with investment, but nobody has considered the effect of politics. So now I'm going to put some variable with intolerance, and that's my thesis. So this is a wrong idea. The encompassing technique says that suppose now you're going to study FDI and there are 5 different models. Your job is not to introduce the 6th model. Your job is now to take all of this. Encompassing means to cover everything. So take all of these 5 models and analyze them for their strengths and weaknesses, and find out that, okay, on these 5 models, this one is strong and this one is weak and this one is false, and then use them all to construct one model which is better than all 5 of them, and to show this. So basically this is the whole point of this in econometrics. 2 of my students have done this. Rahman did a study on, was it foreign exchange determination or something like that, and he looked at 7 different models which people have done. All of these models were then replicated, and then he created a model which covered all of them as special cases. Then he analyzed the restrictions, to see that, okay, this restriction that politicus doesn't come in is rejected. It means that if a model doesn't have the political variable, it can't be right. And so on this model, this variable is not significant, so the social variables can be taken out of this model, and people who are... So all of the models are evaluated on a common basis, and then one model is selected which is the strongest. And so when you come up with the model, it's not just that there are 5 models and mine is the 6th one. Mine is a model which is superior to all existing models. The same thing is true of any field of research. I mean, this is econometrics, but if you are going to study microfinance, so you will say that, okay, there are these 6 theories of microfinance, and people have said this, that, and the other. Now I'm going to take everything into account, and I'm saying I'm going to say the last word in this. So your object is to say the last word, that what I am saying, I have taken into account X, Y, and Z. What X and Y, Z are saying is wrong. What V, W, and Y have said is almost right, but there are the following mistake, and the following people are saying. So you have to cover everything. This is what the encompassing means, and so that is what makes you, gives you the mastery, and that's what you have to do in your research. That you have to cover everything, and you have to debate with everybody. You say, okay, what you're saying is right, what you're saying is wrong, what you're saying is needing modification. So then you will be part of the conversation, and then you will have made a contribution to the literature and so on. Okay, I think I'll stop here. I was going to do some demonstrations on the computer, but I didn't have the time to show you how to do citation searches and so on. All of these things are done in one place or the other. I've given you the website links for the student guide and the research methodology lectures, and a lot of information is contained in these about how to do a literature review, how to write a proposal, and so on, step-by-step guides and so on. So what I have not covered, you will be able to find on these. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Zaman. And now the floor is open for questioning. If people have any questions regarding this presentation, you may ask from Dr. Zal.